In the dusty town of Tombstone, Arizona, where justice was as scarce as water in the desert, a starving orphan boy made a choice that would shake the very foundations of the Wild West. What happened next defied every rule of survival in 1887. 50 armed ranchers surrounded a ramshackle cabin at dawn, but they weren't there to destroy, they were there to protect. The secret they discovered would change everything you thought you knew about the American frontier. The sun blazed mercilessly over the barren landscape of southeastern Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887. Tombstone was a town where hope went to die, where silver mines had dried up faster than morning dew, and where desperate souls clung to life by threads thinner than spider silk. It was here, in this forsaken corner of America, that 12-year-old Thomas McKinnon learned the harsh mathematics of survival. Every morning brought the same cruel equation. One boy, no parents, no money, and a gnawing hunger that felt like wild animals clawing at his insides. Thomas had been living on the streets for 3 months since consumption claimed his mother, the last family he had in this world. His father had vanished into the silver mines 2 years prior, swallowed by a cave-in that left nothing but crushed dreams and unpaid debts. The boy had been surviving on scraps, odd jobs, and the occasional kindness of strangers who saw something worth saving in his determined green eyes. But kindness was a luxury few could afford in Tombstone, where even the rats competed fiercely for every crumb. On this particular scorching Tuesday, Thomas clutched his most precious possession. A small loaf of bread he had earned by mucking out stalls at Henderson's livery stable for 14 hours straight. His small hands were raw and bleeding. His back ached like an old man's, but the bread represented hope. It was enough food to last him 2 days if he rationed carefully, maybe 3 if he could ignore the persistent growling in his stomach. He sat in the narrow alley between Murphy's saloon and the abandoned newspaper office, carefully breaking off small pieces and chewing slowly to make each bite last longer. The sound of shuffling footsteps caught his attention. Around the corner came a figure that made his young heart clench with recognition and sympathy. Martha Whitfield was a widow in her 60s. Once the proud wife of a prosperous cattle rancher who had owned thousands of acres stretching from the Dragoon Mountains to the Chiricahua foothills. But drought, rustlers, and a series of devastating Apache raids had stripped away everything she had built over 30 years of marriage. Her husband died defending their last 100 head of cattle, and creditors had seized every acre, every building, every stick of furniture to settle debts that mounted higher than the surrounding peaks. Now Martha moved through Tombstone like a ghost of better times, her once elegant dresses reduced to tattered rags, her silver hair hanging in unwashed tangles around a face carved deep by loss and hunger. She had been searching through trash heaps and begging at back doors for weeks, too proud to ask directly for help but too desperate to maintain her dignity completely. Thomas watched as she stumbled slightly, catching herself against the rough wooden wall of the saloon, her breathing labored and her movements weak. Their eyes met across the dusty alley, and in that moment, Thomas saw something that cut through his own hunger like a knife through butter. Martha Whitfield was starving in a way that made his own situation look comfortable. Her skin had taken on the grayish pallor of someone whose body was consuming itself. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been robust and strong, and her eyes held the distant look of someone who had begun to accept that death was no longer an enemy to fight but a friend to welcome, without hesitation, without calculation, without the careful consideration that survival demanded. Thomas stood up and walked toward her. The bread felt heavy in his small hands, not because of its weight, but because of what giving it away would mean. He was essentially choosing to go without food for the next 2 days, gambling his own survival on an impulse that went against every lesson the streets had taught him. But something deeper than hunger, something stronger than self-preservation, compelled him forward. Martha looked down at the boy with confusion and wariness. In Tombstone, kindness often came with a price, and unexpected generosity usually masked ulterior motives. But Thomas simply held out the loaf of bread with both hands, offering it like a sacred gift. His voice cracked with the awkward transition between childhood and adolescence as he spoke, but his words carried a sincerity that couldn't be manufactured. She stared at the offering, then at the boy's face, searching for the catch, the demand, the expectation of payment or favor. But Thomas simply stood there, patient and genuine, his own hollow cheeks and too thin frame making his generosity all the more remarkable. Martha's hands trembled as she reached for the bread, and when their fingers touched briefly, she felt tears she thought had dried up months ago beginning to well in her eyes. Thomas watched her take the first bite and saw something miraculous happen. Color returned to her cheeks, her posture straightened slightly, and for just a moment, she looked less like a woman preparing to die and more like someone remembering how to live. He smiled, turned around, and walked away without expecting thanks, without making a show of his charity, without demanding recognition for his sacrifice. In a world where every action seemed calculated for personal gain, his gesture stood out like a beacon of pure human decency. But unknown to both Thomas and Martha, their brief interaction had been observed by someone whose presence in that alley was no coincidence. Samuel Garrett was a man who made his living by watching, by knowing things others preferred to keep hidden, by understanding the intricate web of secrets that connected every soul in Tombstone. He was a private investigator, hired by powerful men to solve problems that couldn't be addressed through official channels. And he had been following Martha Whitfield for 3 weeks at the behest of a client whose identity he guarded as carefully as his own life. Samuel had positioned himself in the shadows between buildings, using the excellent vantage point to document Martha's daily routines, her contacts, her resources, and her vulnerabilities. His client had been very specific about what information was needed, though the reasons remained mysteriously vague. But what Samuel witnessed in that alley changed everything he thought he knew about his surveillance target and made him question the true nature of his assignment for the first time in 20 years of professional observation. As Martha disappeared around the corner with Thomas's bread clutched protectively against her chest, Samuel found himself in an unprecedented situation. His instincts, honed by decades of reading people and situations, told him that something significant had just occurred, something that went far beyond a simple act of childhood charity. There was a weight to what he had witnessed, a sense that forces larger than individual kindness were at work in this dusty Arizona town. That evening, Samuel sat in his hotel room at the Cosmopolitan, writing his daily report for transmission via telegraph to his mysterious client in San Francisco. But for the first time in his career, he found himself editing the truth, omitting certain details and protecting information rather than revealing it. The interaction between the orphan boy and the widow seemed too pure, too important to be reduced to cold facts in a surveillance report. Something told him that complete honesty in this case might serve purposes he couldn't yet understand and wouldn't necessarily approve of. Meanwhile, Thomas spent the night in his usual sleeping place, a sheltered corner behind the assay office where the wind couldn't reach him but where he could still see the stars through a gap in the buildings. His stomach cramped with hunger, and he tried to distract himself by counting constellations and making up stories about the lives they represented. But despite his physical discomfort, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction that was entirely new to his young experience. For the first time since becoming truly alone in the world, he had made a choice based on something other than survival, had acted from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. 3 blocks away, Martha Whitfield sat in the abandoned storage room behind Chen's laundry that had served as her shelter for the past month. The bread Thomas had given her represented more than mere sustenance. It had reminded her that human kindness still existed in a world that seemed designed to crush such sentiments. As she carefully wrapped the remaining portion for tomorrow's meal, she found herself thinking not just about the boy's generosity, but about the strange circumstances that had led to their meeting. Something nagged at her memory, a half-formed recognition that she couldn't quite grasp. The boy looked familiar in a way that went beyond their recent encounters around town. There was something about his features, the set of his shoulders, the particular shade of his green eyes, that triggered memories she couldn't immediately place. But exhaustion and malnutrition had made clear thinking difficult, and she pushed the puzzle aside in favor of the more immediate concern of conserving her strength for tomorrow's challenges. Neither Martha nor Thomas could have imagined that their simple exchange had set in motion a series of events that would ultimately involve cattle barons, missing persons, hidden identities, and secrets that had been buried for more than a decade. The truth about their connection stretched back to a time when Martha Whitfield had been one of the most influential women in Arizona territory, when her ranch had been the envy of every landowner from Tucson to El Paso, and when a terrible decision had been made that would haunt multiple families for generations. The next morning brought news that rippled through Tombstone like wildfire spread by desert winds. James Morrison, the town's most successful remaining businessman and owner of the largest general store, announced that he had received a telegram from investors in Chicago expressing interest in purchasing several properties in the area. The prospect of outside money coming to their dying town generated excitement and speculation among residents who had grown accustomed to disappointment and decline. But Samuel Garrett recognized the announcement for what it really was: a carefully orchestrated fiction designed to provide cover for activities that had nothing to do with legitimate business investment. His 20 years of experience had taught him to see through such manufactured stories, and his investigative instincts told him that the mysterious Chicago investors were connected to his own surveillance assignment in ways he was only beginning to understand. That afternoon, as Thomas scrounged for work that might earn him enough money for food, he noticed something unusual happening around town. Men he had never seen before were asking questions about residents, particularly about families who had lived in the area for many years. They dressed like businessmen but moved like hunters, and their questions had an urgency that suggested they were searching for something specific, rather than conducting routine inquiries. One of these strangers approached Thomas while he was cleaning windows at the barbershop, offering him a silver dollar in exchange for information about people he might have observed during his time on the streets. The man was particularly interested in elderly residents, especially women who might have been living in the area for several decades. Thomas's survival instincts, sharpened by months of careful observation, warned him that something about the inquiry felt dangerous, predatory in a way that had nothing to do with legitimate business interests. The boy politely declined the money and claimed to know nothing about the town's long-term residents, but the encounter left him deeply unsettled. In his experience, adults who offered children money for information were rarely motivated by benevolent purposes, and the stranger's intense interest in elderly women seemed particularly ominous. Thomas decided to be more careful about his movements and to pay closer attention to the people around him, especially those who seemed to be watching rather than simply going about their daily business. Meanwhile, Martha had noticed the same group of strangers, and their presence triggered memories and fears she had spent years trying to suppress. During her decades as a successful rancher's wife, she had learned to recognize the signs of trouble long before it arrived at her doorstep. These men carried themselves like professionals, like people accustomed to solving problems through methods that didn't rely on legal channels or ethical constraints. As the day progressed, Martha found herself remembering details from her past that she had deliberately forgotten, pieces of a puzzle that had remained incomplete for more than 15 years. The arrival of these investigators, combined with her recent encounter with the generous orphan boy, was stirring memories of events and people she had convinced herself were safely buried in the past. But memory, like truth, had a way of refusing to stay hidden forever, especially when outside forces were determined to bring it into the light. That evening, Samuel Garrett made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Instead of maintaining his professional distance and continuing his surveillance from the shadows, he chose to make direct contact with Martha Whitfield. The reasons for this unprecedented breach of protocol were complex, rooted partly in professional concern about the other investigators and partly in a growing conviction that his client's true motives were not aligned with Martha's safety or well-being. He found her behind Chen's laundry as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him why he had originally been drawn to the Southwest despite its harsh reputation. Martha looked up from the small fire she had built to warm the remaining bread from Thomas's gift, and Samuel saw in her eyes the immediate recognition of someone who had spent years looking over her shoulder for exactly this kind of approach. Samuel introduced himself honestly, explaining his profession and acknowledging that he had been hired to investigate her background and current circumstances. But instead of interrogating her or demanding information, he warned her about the other men who had arrived in town, men whose methods and motives he found considerably more troubling than his own. He told her that powerful people were looking for her, that they had resources and determination that suggested this was not a casual inquiry, and that she was in danger whether she understood the reasons or not. Martha listened to his warning with the stoic composure of someone who had survived too many crises to panic easily, but Samuel could see the calculation happening behind her weathered features. She was evaluating options, considering possibilities, and preparing for whatever confrontation had been hunting her for all these years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority and intelligence that had once made her one of the most respected women in Arizona territory. She told Samuel that she had been expecting this day for 15 years, that she had always known her past would eventually catch up with her despite her efforts to disappear into anonymity and poverty. The details of that past, the reasons why powerful people might want to find her, and the secrets she had been guarding would require more explanation than a brief evening conversation could accommodate. But she agreed to trust him provisionally, partly because she had few alternatives and partly because something about his manner suggested that his warnings were genuine rather than manipulative. As they talked, neither Martha nor Samuel noticed the small figure watching from the shadows between buildings 50 yards away. Thomas had developed the skill of moving unseen through Tombstone's back alleys and hidden spaces, and his concern for Martha's welfare had led him to follow her that evening to ensure she was safe. What he overheard of their conversation filled him with alarm and confusion, references to investigations and danger that seemed far removed from the simple act of sharing bread with a hungry woman. The boy's presence remained undetected, but his sharp ears caught enough fragments of dialogue to understand that Martha was in some kind of trouble, that people were looking for her for reasons that sounded ominous, and that the kind stranger who had accepted his bread was now caught up in circumstances that could threaten her life. Thomas had lived on the streets long enough to understand that adults often created problems that endangered innocent people, but he felt a personal responsibility for Martha's safety that he couldn't explain or ignore. After Samuel and Martha concluded their conversation and went their separate ways, Thomas spent the night awake and thinking, trying to process what he had learned and decide how a 12-year-old boy with no resources or connections could possibly help protect someone from professional investigators and powerful enemies. The mathematics of the situation seemed impossible, but something deeper than logic told him that he couldn't simply stand by and watch harm come to someone who had shown him such gratitude for his small gesture of kindness. The next morning brought developments that accelerated the timeline for everyone involved. Martha received a message, delivered by a nervous Chinese boy from Chen's Laundry, requesting her presence at a meeting that afternoon at the abandoned Silver Strike mine outside of town. The message was unsigned but mentioned specific details about her past that proved the sender knew far more about her history than any casual observer could have discovered through normal investigation. Samuel, meanwhile, received a telegram from his client that dramatically expanded the scope of his assignment and authorized the use of resources that suggested this case was far more important than a routine background investigation. The new instructions included references to legal documents, property rights, and inheritance claims that painted a very different picture of why Martha Whitfield had become the focus of such intense attention that as these adult machinations moved toward their inevitable conclusion, Thomas made a decision that demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years and courage that would have impressed seasoned frontiersmen twice his age. Instead of trying to intervene directly in situations he couldn't understand or control, he decided to become Martha's eyes and ears, to use his ability to move unseen through Tombstone to gather information about the people who posed a threat to her safety. The boy spent the morning following the strange investigators, listening to their conversations, observing their methods, and slowly piecing together a picture of their true purpose in town. What he learned was both more and less sinister than he had expected, a complex story of legal claims and family secrets that stretched back to the earliest days of Arizona Territory and involved some of the most powerful families in the American West. By noon, Thomas had gathered enough information to understand that Martha's meeting at the Silver Strike mine was almost certainly a trap, that the people seeking her intended to resolve their business through intimidation or worse, and that she was walking into a situation where her years of hiding and anonymity would provide no protection against enemies who had finally tracked her to ground. But Thomas also learned something that changed everything about how he understood his own place in this unfolding drama. One conversation he overheard between two of the investigators contained references to family names, dates, and locations that connected directly to his own fragmented memories of life before his parents died. The realization that his fate and Martha's were linked by more than coincidental charity hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to reconceptualize everything he thought he knew about his own identity and history. Armed with this new understanding, Thomas faced a choice that would define not just the next few hours but potentially the rest of his life. He could try to warn Martha about the trap and hope she would listen to a 12-year-old boy's concerns. He could seek help from the few adults in town who might be willing to get involved in dangerous business, or he could take direct action using the advantages his size and invisibility provided to disrupt whatever plans were being made against the woman who had shown him such kindness. The decision came easier than he expected, driven not by calculation but by an instinctive understanding of right and wrong that cut through all the complex adult motivations and competing interests. Martha Whitfield had treated him with dignity and gratitude when she accepted his bread. had looked at him like he was a person worth knowing rather than just another street orphan to be pitied or avoided. That recognition of his humanity demanded a response that honored the connection they had formed, regardless of the personal risk involved. Thomas spent the early afternoon gathering supplies and making preparations for what he knew would be the most dangerous thing he had ever attempted. His plan was simple in concept but would require perfect timing, considerable luck, and a kind of courage that he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. But the alternative was allowing Martha to walk into a trap that would almost certainly result in her disappearance or death. And that possibility was simply unacceptable to the boy who had learned that sometimes survival required protecting others rather than just protecting yourself. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in the golden light that made even Tombstone look beautiful, the various players in this drama began moving toward their convergence. At the abandoned Silver Strike mine, Martha walked steadily through the sagebrush and scattered rocks, her expression calm but her senses alert to every sound and movement in the landscape around her. Samuel Garrett followed at a distance, positioned to observe and potentially intervene if the situation became openly violent. The mysterious investigators from back east took their positions around the mine entrance, confident in their superior numbers and resources, and 50 yards ahead of them all, hidden in a crevice between boulders where he had waited for 2 hours, 12-year-old Thomas McKinnon prepared to discover whether one small boy's determination could change the outcome of forces that had been building momentum for more than 15 years. As Martha approached the mine entrance, the late afternoon, shadows were beginning to stretch long across the desert floor, creating patterns of light and darkness that would soon become crucial elements in the confrontation that was about to unfold. She moved with the steady pace of someone who had accepted whatever fate awaited her, but her experienced eyes constantly scanned the terrain for signs of ambush or escape routes. Years of living on a working ranch had taught her to read landscapes like other people read books, and what she saw around the Silver Strike mine told a story of careful preparation and overwhelming odds. The investigators revealed themselves when Martha was still 30 yards from the mine entrance, emerging from concealment with the coordinated precision of men who had executed similar operations many times before. Their leader was a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked incongruous in the desert setting but served to emphasize his authority and resources. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultivated accent of Eastern education and the confidence of someone accustomed to having his demands met without question. He addressed Martha by her full name, Martha Elizabeth Whitfield, and then added details about her background that proved his investigation had been thorough and professional. He knew about her late husband's ranch, about the debts that had consumed their property, about her subsequent poverty and homelessness in Tombstone. But more significantly, he knew about events from much earlier in her life, secrets she had thought were buried so deep that no amount of investigation could uncover them. The man explained that he represented the interests of the Pemberton family of Boston, specifically the heirs of Jonathan Pemberton, who had died the previous winter, leaving behind a complex estate that included property claims dating back to the 1860s. Martha's face showed no change of expression at the mention of that name, but Samuel Garrett, watching from his hidden position, saw her hands tremble slightly before she clasped them together to maintain her composure. What followed was a conversation that revealed the true scope of the drama that had been building for decades. Martha Elizabeth Whitfield, the impoverished widow living in an abandoned storage room, was actually Martha Elizabeth Pemberton Whitfield, the missing daughter and sole heir of one of Boston's most prominent industrial families. Her disappearance from Massachusetts in 1871 had triggered a legal battle that had consumed courts and lawyers for 16 years, generating competing claims to a fortune that included railroad investments, shipping companies, and vast real estate holdings across the eastern United States. The investigators had finally traced her to Arizona territory through a combination of persistence, advancing technology, and a crucial piece of evidence that had recently surfaced in the form of a letter, written by her late husband to a lawyer in Tucson. That letter, discovered among legal documents being processed after a law firm's dissolution, had provided the final confirmation needed to locate the missing heiress and resolve the Pemberton estate once and for all. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that Martha's inheritance was not the investigators' primary concern. The Pemberton family's current heirs had been living comfortably on the estate's income for years, and Martha's sudden reappearance threatened to disrupt arrangements that had enriched multiple generations of distant relatives. The investigators' real purpose was to secure Martha's agreement to renounce her inheritance claims in exchange for a modest settlement that would ensure her silence and cooperation. Martha listened to their proposal with the stoic patience of someone who had learned not to show emotion during negotiations that could determine her fate. The offer was substantial by the standards of someone living in poverty but represented a tiny fraction of her legitimate inheritance. More importantly, accepting their terms would require her to sign legal documents acknowledging her identity and whereabouts, effectively ending the anonymity that had protected her from other consequences of her past. As the investigators pressed for her immediate agreement to their proposal, emphasizing the generous nature of their offer and the potential complications that could arise if she proved uncooperative, Thomas McKinnon prepared to execute the plan he had been developing throughout the afternoon. His position among the rocks gave him a clear view of the entire scene and, more critically, access to the old mining equipment that had been abandoned when the silver strike played out 5 years earlier. The boy had spent considerable time that afternoon exploring the mine's surface installations, learning how the various mechanical systems had operated and identifying which components could be manipulated to create maximum disruption. His plan relied on timing, distraction, and the investigators' natural tendency to focus on what they perceived as the primary threat while ignoring peripheral details that seemed unimportant. Thomas waited until the conversation between Martha and the investigators had reached its most intense point, when all attention was focused on her response to their demands and their positioning had become static and predictable. Then he began implementing a sequence of actions he had rehearsed mentally dozens of times, starting with the release of brake mechanisms on a large cart that had been positioned on rails leading down the hillside toward the mine entrance. The sound of metal wheels beginning to turn on rusted rails was subtle at first, but as the cart gathered momentum and weight, it became an increasingly ominous rumble that drew everyone's attention away from their negotiations and toward the approaching danger. The investigators scattered as the runaway cart crashed through the area where they had been standing, creating chaos and confusion that provided exactly the distraction Thomas had hoped to achieve. But the boys' plan included multiple phases, and the cart was merely the opening gambit in a more complex strategy. As the investigators regrouped and tried to reestablish control over the situation, Thomas triggered the release of several other pieces of equipment, creating a cascading series of mechanical failures that transformed the mine site from a controlled environment into a dangerous chaos where no one could predict what might happen next. The investigators found themselves dealing with multiple emergencies simultaneously, from runaway machinery to structural collapses to dangerous debris fields that made their carefully planned positions untenable. In the confusion, Martha demonstrated that her years of ranch life had taught her skills that poverty and age had not diminished. She moved through the chaos with sure footing and clear purpose, using the distraction to position herself for escape while the investigators struggled to maintain their advantage. Samuel Garrett seized the opportunity to abandon his observer role and become an active participant in the unfolding events. His years of professional experience included situations where violence was expected and necessary, and he moved through the disrupted mine site with the efficiency of someone trained to handle multiple threats simultaneously. But instead of engaging the investigators directly, he focused on creating additional confusion and ensuring that Martha had the time and space needed to reach safety. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun the most dangerous phase of his plan, using his small size and agility to move through spaces that would be inaccessible to adults while continuing to trigger mechanical disruptions that kept the investigators off balance and reactive rather than proactive. The boy had realized that his greatest advantages were his ability to move unseen and his understanding of the mine's abandoned equipment, both of which could be leveraged to create far more chaos than his physical size might suggest. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the desert began its transformation from day to evening, the situation at the Silver Strike mine had evolved into something none of the original participants had anticipated. The investigators' carefully planned confrontation had devolved into a running battle against both human opponents and mechanical hazards. Martha had demonstrated survival skills that belied her apparent helplessness, and Samuel had committed himself to protecting someone he had originally been hired to investigate. But the most surprising development was the emergence of Thomas McKinnon as a strategic force capable of changing the outcome of conflicts involving trained professionals with superior resources and experience. The boy's intervention had not only disrupted the investigators' plans, but had revealed capabilities and intelligence that suggested his future held possibilities far beyond what his current circumstances might indicate. The investigators, realizing that their original approach had failed completely, made the decision to withdraw and regroup rather than continuing to struggle against increasingly unfavorable conditions. Their leader shouted instructions that could be heard across the mine site, ordering a tactical retreat that would allow them to reconsider their options and develop new strategies for achieving their objectives. But as they prepared to leave, he also made it clear that this was a temporary setback rather than a permanent defeat. Martha, Samuel, and Thomas found themselves alone at the abandoned mine as the sun touched the western horizon and painted the desert sky in colors that seemed to celebrate their unlikely victory. But even as they caught their breath and began to process what had just occurred, all three understood that the day's events had resolved nothing fundamental about their situation. The investigators would return with better preparation and more resources. Martha's inheritance would continue to make her a target for people with competing interests, and Thomas had revealed his involvement in ways that would make him a factor in whatever came next. As they made their way back toward Tombstone through the gathering dusk, the three unlikely allies began the process of understanding how their individual stories had become interconnected and what their shared future might hold. Martha finally began to reveal the details of her past that explained why her inheritance had become such a contentious issue. Samuel shared what he had learned about the forces arrayed against them, and Thomas listened with the intense concentration of someone whose entire understanding of his own identity was being reconstructed with each new piece of information. The walk back to town took them through terrain that looked deceptively peaceful in the evening light, but all three remained alert to the possibility of additional threats or complications. Their victory at the mine had been tactical rather than strategic, and they knew that more dangerous confrontations lay ahead. But something had changed in the dynamics between them, a shared experience that had created bonds of trust and mutual dependence that would prove crucial in the challenges to come as they reached the outskirts of Tombstone. Martha made a decision that surprised both Samuel and Thomas. Instead of returning to her hiding place behind Chen's laundry, she announced her intention to claim her inheritance and face whatever consequences might follow from that choice. Her years of hiding and anonymity had protected her from her enemies, but had also prevented her from living the life she deserved or using her resources to help others who needed them. The transformation in Martha's demeanor was remarkable to observe. The defeated and desperately poor widow who had gratefully accepted bread from a starving orphan boy was being replaced by someone who carried herself with the authority and confidence of the successful rancher's wife she had once been. But more than that, she was becoming someone who understood that her wealth and position came with responsibilities that extended beyond her own survival and comfort. Thomas watched this transformation with fascination and growing understanding. The woman who had accepted his bread with such gratitude was revealing herself to be someone whose resources could change not just her own circumstances, but the lives of many other people who found themselves trapped by poverty and hopelessness in places like Tombstone. The implications of that realization were staggering for a 12-year-old boy who had never imagined that his simple act of kindness might be connected to forces that could reshape entire communities. Samuel found himself reevaluating everything he had assumed about his assignment and his client's motivations. The investigation he had originally understood as a routine background check had revealed itself to be part of a much larger struggle involving inheritance law, family politics, and competing claims to one of America's great industrial fortunes. His decision to protect Martha rather than continuing his surveillance had aligned him with interests that were far more complex and significant than he had originally realized. As they entered Tombstone proper and began moving through streets that looked the same as always but felt fundamentally different after the day's revelations, the three allies began planning their next steps. Martha would need to establish her legal identity and begin the process of claiming her inheritance, which would require lawyers, documentation, and protection from those who would benefit from preventing her success. Samuel would need to manage his relationship with his original client while developing new strategies for ensuring Martha's safety. Thomas would need to understand how his own history connected to these larger forces and what role he might play in the events that were sure to follow. But even as they made practical plans for addressing immediate challenges, all three understood that something profound had changed in their lives that went beyond questions of money, inheritance, or legal rights. The connections they had formed through circumstances that had seemed random were revealing themselves to be part of patterns that stretched back through years of history and forward into possibilities that none of them had previously imagined. The bread that Thomas had shared with Martha in that dusty alley behind Murphy's saloon had been more than a simple act of charity between strangers. It had been the catalyst for revelations that would ultimately involve some of the most powerful families in America, legal battles that would be decided in courts from Boston to San Francisco, and changes that would affect the lives of hundreds of people across the territories of the American West. As they reached the center of town and began to separate toward their individual destinations for the night, Martha turned to Thomas with an expression that combined gratitude, determination, and something that might have been hope. She told him that his kindness had reminded her of who she used to be and who she had the power to become again, that his courage had inspired her to stop hiding from her responsibilities and start facing them with the strength she had almost forgotten she possessed. Thomas looked up at this woman who was transforming before his eyes from a desperate widow into an heiress whose decisions could affect the lives of thousands of people, and he realized that his own transformation was just beginning. The orphan boy who had shared his last bread with a starving stranger was about to discover that his capacity for kindness and courage had connected him to forces that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his own identity and potential. Samuel watched these exchanges with the professional objectivity of someone trained to observe and analyze human behavior, but he could not ignore his own emotional response to witnessing the power of genuine human connection to overcome circumstances that had seemed hopeless just hours earlier. His career had exposed him to the worst aspects of human nature, but the events of this day had reminded him that nobility and courage could emerge from the most unlikely sources and transform situations that seemed beyond redemption. The next morning would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new dangers as word of Martha's reappearance spread beyond Tombstone to reach the powerful interests that had been searching for her for 16 years. But as the three allies settled into their respective shelters for the night, each carried with them the understanding that they had found something more valuable than gold or silver in the connections they had forged through shared courage and mutual protection. The story that had begun with a hungry boy sharing bread with a starving widow had revealed itself to be the opening chapter of a much larger narrative involving inheritance, identity, justice, and the power of ordinary people to influence extraordinary events through simple acts of human decency and unexpected courage. And as dawn approached over the desert landscape of Arizona Territory, bringing with it the promise of new challenges and new possibilities, 50 armed ranchers were already moving toward Tombstone with orders to ensure that Martha Elizabeth Pemberton Whitfield lived long enough to claim what was rightfully hers and use her resources to transform the American West in ways that no one could yet fully imagine.